Today we have seen a lineup of Liberal politicians facing the media, lining up one by one, telling the story about themselves, defending themselves, explaining themselves, wondering if they have a job, don't have a job, who will be the leader. Mr. Acting Deputy President, an extraordinary display that says more about the character and the content of this cabinet of the Turnbull government. We saw a government bleeding today, not bleeding for the country, Mr. Acting Deputy President, but bleeding for themselves and their own jobs. We see a divided cabinet. We see a government so hopelessly in disarray that the best alternative for a leader they could think of did not support even the national apology to First Nations people in this country. For shame, what have they become? They fight over energy, they fight over climate change, they fight over tax, they fight over industrial relations, they fight over education, they fight over principles that they have long since abandoned. They fight for their own jobs, but they will not fight for the Australian people. Mr. Acting Deputy President, while this internal bickering continues and the member for Dickson rallies his troops, the people of Australia suffer, and the people of the Northern Territory suffer. Housing, the lack of housing. We hear the minister stand up in this House talking about thousands and thousands of jobs that are being created across the country for First Nations people. Well, where are those jobs? Where are those jobs? Because where I sit, where I travel across the regions of remote and regional Australia, they are not there. Industry is closing, businesses are closing, and not enough houses, certainly for those who are homeless, certainly for those people who have been demanding their fair share and rights for homes in this country. Last week in this place, Mr. Acting Deputy President, we saw a vote against a bill to restore the rights of the Territory. That is because this government only cares about themselves. They certainly did not care about the people of the Northern Territory when we sat here in this parliament. Last week we saw Senator Jane Hume say that due to the Territory's small population, the people of the Northern Territory were incapable of making decisions on complex social policy issues. Why do I raise that? Not because it was part of the debate, Mr. Acting Deputy President, but it was a statement that was made in the political arena on Sky News after the devastating debate and outcome for the people of the Northern Territory. It wasn't enough, Mr. Acting Deputy President, that the people of the Northern Territory had felt enormously aggrieved, deeply hurt, completely betrayed by this House, and then to be insulted. Talk about rubbing salt in the wounds. It wasn't enough that you won the vote by 2, mind you, and we're going to have another go at some point. It wasn't enough. You had to go out there and insult the people of the Northern Territory. I've written to the Prime Minister demanding an apology, although I doubt he'll have time to even think about the people of the Northern Territory now that he's busy trying to save himself. And on that point, the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull that is, stands in front of the press conference today and talks about how we must get back to the people of Australia, how we must govern for the people of Australia. Yeah, that's right, you do, Prime Minister. However, you are very much contributing to eroding the rights of citizens in the Northern Territory and in the ACT, not because you believed in the fact that they shouldn't have equal citizenship, but it was because you did not want to have that as a problem in that House. That's not governing for all Australians, and that's not doing it in the fairness of what this country stands for and the values of democracy in this country. You were so busy trying to prevent a debate going to your House that you were going to do anything in this place to make sure that senators voted the way you wanted them to vote, even though it was a conscience vote. That is a clear example of your inability, the inability of the Turnbull government to progress any coherent policy or legislative agenda in either this place or the other one. It is shameful that this parliament decided that the people of the Northern Territory are second-class citizens. We do deserve the same rights as all Australians. And while we wait for the government to decide whom it should have as its leader, the Northern Territory suffers, just like every other jurisdiction in this country. And while we wait and continue to wait, we wonder about the pieces of legislation and policy that this mob over here should be progressing to improve the lives of Australians. The city's deal for Darwin, for example, sits on the Prime Minister's desk gathering dust. The funding for Central Arnhem Highway and the Buntine Highways remains unclear and unaccounted for. And yet you stand up here saying that it's in the budget. And that amount of money that's in the budget is only going to cover a couple of hundred kilometres. The Central Arnhem Highway goes for 600 or 700 kilometres. So don't do us any favours in the Northern Territory. Be genuine and real about what you're trying to do. But you can't because you're distracted. You're too busy looking at your own selves. The funding for our schools remains unaccounted for. The funding for our hospitals remains unclear. And every day that this government talks about themselves is another day that Australians pay the price of nothing getting done. Our costs to access and healthcare higher than ever, energy bills and cost of living, which you cannot seem to get sorted on that side, skyrocketing under the Liberals, and wage growth lower than ever. These are not conditions in which the people of Australia, the people of the Northern Territory, can thrive. These conditions only make our situation worse, Mr Acting Deputy President. This is a government here who claims to stand up for regional and rural Australians. Really? Really? A pick fact out in Forbes says you care? Come on, guys. Get your act together. You cut funding to ABC shortwave radio, allowing China to fill the void in the South Pacific. You cut funding to Charles Darwin University, damaging our future in the north. And don't let me go to the North Australia policy. What about the North Australia Infrastructure Fund? $5 billion over nearly 4 years. And what have you got to show for it? You keep hanging it out in front of people who desperately need the infrastructure to build, the businesses to grow, and you tease the people of Northern Australia. You tease them. And then you come back here and you jostle for your jobs. You jostle for the leadership. Who's going to be in the cabinet? You're too busy wondering about, are you going to get that extra dollar? And yet people out there are hungry. They're starving. They're homeless. And all you can do is think about yourselves. You've stuffed up the NBN. You've cut funding to our primary and high schools. You've neglected even the First Nations media organisations with no policy direction or new funding commitments, no support to creating real jobs and career pathways. And what about the Royal Commission into youth detention, which was caused by an incompetent country Liberal Party government bearing your brand? You continue to impose the disastrous and discriminatory CDP program in remote communities, despite empty promises of change and illusory improvements. What you're doing is entrenching poverty to the most disadvantaged Australians in this country. But you wouldn't be thinking about that right now, would you? The entrenched poverty out there can keep going, so long as your wealth in here gets sorted. Mr Acting Deputy President, this government is a shambles. This government has lost the confidence not only of its own team, of its own party, of its own cabinet. This government, Mr Acting Deputy President, has lost the confidence of all Australians.